Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that my holiday cooking has gotten all messed up. This quarantine business made me rethink how I cook, how much I cook, when I cook. So in the spirit of making lemonade out of lemons, I am rethinking some of my old family recipes, trying to make them fit my new normal, my new unnormal normal. So in that spirit, I present unstuffed stuffing cakes. My hairdresser, Merle, the other day mentioned this, that someone had told her they did theirs as a fried patty, and she said she tried it and it didn't work. So I thought I'd see if I could figure it out. And from now on, these are going to be a part of my new normal. And you can feast your eyes on this little tidbit. Aurora Seagrave's third great-grandchild, while I remind you that if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it very much. Now let's get cooking. You know, I just sat down and gave this some thought, and it just seemed to make a lot of sense. I'm thinking of these as something you would serve when you have meat on a buffet or a snack tray. I'm going to use 2 cups of self-rising cornmeal, about a cup of chicken broth, and my spices here are parsley, rosemary, thyme, and I picked some kind of ready-looking sage from my garden, but it'll be good. I have some pieces of celery sticks here. It would be 2 full-size sticks, 3 small ones. I have an orange here, and I will explain why later. And a pepper, I'm going to use half of it. I have 2 eggs, and I have 2 leeks. I've trimmed them and cut off all the green, which you want to always do. And you can use 1 onion instead. So I've cut all my vegetables up in my little food processor here, my Christmas present from my youngest son. And just so you know, these are the vegetables that I use when I make dressing. When I make dressing or stuffing, I cook them first. That's because stuffing your turkey or your chicken with raw vegetables is not a good idea. But I don't have to do that in this dish, because they'll get fully cooked. You'll see I cut them up pretty small because these will be patties and big chunks may not cook enough. In this bowl, I've measured out 2 cups of self-rising cornmeal, and I emphasize self-rising. If your cornmeal is not self-rising, you want to add 2 teaspoons baking powder, a half a teaspoonful of salt. So I'm going to add all my dry ingredients together. That's the cornmeal. That's a half teaspoonful of rosemary. Note, I should have used a whole teaspoon. It would have been a little tastier. This is only the second time I've made this, so I'm adjusting my spices as I go. Then a teaspoonful of dried thyme. Here's a note. If you don't want to add all these separate spices and the sage, you can just use a couple teaspoons full of poultry seasoning. That's less total volume than I'm using here, but it seems to me that poultry seasoning is a little more concentrated in flavor. So that's half teaspoon rosemary, a teaspoon of thyme, a teaspoon of parsley, or 2 teaspoons poultry seasoning, and leave out the sage. So I've picked about 6 little leaves of this sage from my garden. It's January and it looks a little sad, but it still smells wonderful. I'm snipping it up pretty tiny here. You know, I used to harvest a bunch of sage in about October or November and dry it. But I've found that my sage grows year-round, and while it's not always bright and fresh looking, it's always great tasting. So I'm just going to mix all this together. Now again, if you're not using self-rising cornmeal, you'd add your baking powder and your salt and mix that all in here with this. Self-rising cornmeal is not gluten-free. It has just a little bit of flour in it. So if you're eating gluten-free, use the plain unleavened cornmeal. So now I'm going to put my veggies in and sort of stir them around and coat them all really well with the cornmeal. And that's a lot of veggies for the amount of cornmeal that I have. But it works out just perfect. And I'll let you know that when I was trying this recipe out, I tried doing it with breadcrumbs and already cooked cornbread, which is how I make my dressing. But I found that didn't really work well. It was hard to keep them together and it was gooey in the middle. But I found that starting with a corn fritter recipe or a corn cake recipe was the key to getting the texture right, along with using 2 eggs instead of 1. I would only use 1 egg in my corn fritter recipe. So here are my 2 eggs, and I'm going to beat them up until they're a little frothy. Now my eggs are jumbo eggs. You could use 2 large eggs, and I can't tell you an exact amount on liquid yet, because that's going to vary based on which size egg you use. But it's going to be about half a cup of broth, and I'm using chicken broth. But you can use vegetable broth. I often do when I make my stuffing. And if you were serving it with sliced beef, you could use beef broth. It's your choice. So I've measured half a cup of chicken broth, and later I added 2 tablespoons more. So the key at this point is you don't want too much liquid. That would be true with corn fritters also. You want a stiff batter so that it holds together properly when you're frying these. So I'm going to mix it up really well and make sure I don't have too much, but I may have to add just a little bit more because you want to make sure and get all of the dry ingredients mixed in. Okay, I've mixed that all together, and now I'm going to add the orange. And I'm just going to cut this orange into quarters and then squeeze it in. That's about an ounce of orange juice, and if you want to just use bottled orange juice, that's fine. So why an orange? Besides the fact that the orange brightens up the flavor, you want to get some action from your baking powder. You do that by adding some acid. If I were just making corn fritters, I would use buttermilk because that activates the baking powder. But I'm not using any milk in this, so I'm adding a little bit of acid by using orange juice. Without some added acid, the stuffing cakes are going to be dense and heavy. But an added benefit is that the addition of this little bit of orange juice really gives the cakes, the finished product, a beautiful flavor. So I'm just going to stir this up enough to incorporate the orange juice, and then I'll let it sit for about 15 to 20 minutes to let the action of the baking powder and the acid make it rise a little bit, give it a little bit of lightness. I'm looking at this and thinking, maybe should have used about 2 tablespoons less chicken broth. But I'm going to let it rise and see what texture I have. You can see there it'll stand up on my fork like mashed potatoes. And I may need it to be a little bit stiffer. But after it rises and rests, I'll come back and check it. And after a 15-minute rest, I've got some little pockets of liquid there. So I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons full. I'm sorry I was estimating, but you want to add enough so that there's no free liquid, and you may not have to add any, especially if you're using just large and not jumbo eggs. So I'm going to have to add a little bit more. So I'm going to stir that in. All together, I think I've put in about 4 tablespoons full, and I think that's going to do it. So I'll get this all mixed up, and then I'm going to meet you at the stove. I have about 1/4 inch of grapeseed oil in here, and I have it on medium-low temperature. Normally we would do medium temperature if we were frying, say, corn cakes. We're going to need this to be a little lower than normal. You can see that I dropped in that little bit of batter to check my temperature to make sure it didn't brown too quickly. I have 2 kitchen spoons here, and I dipped the first one down into the oil. This will help keep the batter from sticking to the spoon. I use spoons. You can use a scoop. Each one of mine's going to be about 1.5 ounces. You can make them bigger or smaller. And if you know me, you know that mine are going to be bigger and smaller. I'm not very consistent. You'll need to flatten each one out with the spoon to make sure that they get done all the way through. Now I can cook about 4 at a time in a 10-inch skillet. This recipe makes about 12 at this size. Now I'm going to remind you of the rules of frying. Yes, there are rules of frying. When you put something in the pan to fry, you put it in and you leave it alone. You don't touch it until it starts to brown and let go of the skillet. If you're not happy with your fried foods, you're probably not using the rules of frying. If the breading comes off your chicken or your pork chops, it's because you didn't leave it alone and you tried to turn it too soon. So what you're looking for is if you just touch it and it'll skid across the pan, then it's ready to be turned. It has let go from the metal of the pan. And this is one reason that I love using good cast iron, because when you're frying in cast iron, you get that perfect crust on the bottom. At this low heat now, I'm going to let these cook for about 60 to 90 seconds on each side. The difference in the 60 and the 90 is you want to let them cook long enough that you see browning coming up the side. When you see some nice golden browning coming up the side, it's time to turn it. And the way I turn them is I take my spoon. Sorry you can't see it from my hands. I take my spoon dipped in the hot fat, slide the turner under, and I steady it with the spoon because it'll scoot right across the pan. I just have to have something to hold it in place. I think you can see this one better. There you go. Now see that nice golden color? This is the reason I said to keep your heat medium-low, on the low side. So I've time-lapsed this a little, and these have been about 90 seconds on the other side. Now I'm going to flip them one more time. And yes, we've still got that beautiful golden color on the other side. And really, you just flip them over to check to make sure that you've got the right color on the bottom side. Now you'll notice that even though I flattened these out when I put them in the pan, now they're puffy. They rose up. That's the action of the baking powder and the acid. And that gives them a nice, light, almost spongy texture when you bite into them. I'm taking these out. That one's fighting me. I'm taking these out. I'm putting them on a rack over a paper towel. I'll finish frying the rest of these, plate them up, and meet you for dinner. So I have 2 of these, and I have a little side dish of cranberry sauce. I'm going to confess I cheated. That's just canned cranberry sauce. But whatever cranberry relish you make, it's going to go wonderfully with these. You see all the veggies and the herbs, the the sage all through it. These are very crispy and light, and I know you can hear that crunchiness. I'm thinking these would be perfect on a buffet. I'm also thinking they would be perfect as a Super Bowl snack. And you know, I'm just going to pick that up and dip it. I'm eating alone. Nobody cares if I double dip. You can think of these as a side dish. You can think of them as a snack. You can think of them as your bread to a meal. However you think of them, I urge you to think of making them. And I hope when you do, you like them as much as I do. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.